I would go ahead and show another painting documentary. They seem to be popular. I think everyone especially really enjoyed the Vincent van Gogh. So the last hour or so of class today, we'll actually watch one on Edvard Munch's The Scream. Yeah?
I wanted to ask last time we watched the last one about Van Gogh. I'm not saying it's bad, but like, what if he didn't mean to actually do all his mistakes on purpose? Like when he put the brush up to make like a 3D dimension, like what if he was just like inexperienced, he didn't know how to actually paint flat? And we just like mistook that for like him knowing everything, apparently. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like he knows how to paint.
He would have made the mistake so many times in a row that the odds of it being a mistake each and every time would be probably worse than you entering the super lottery. I mean, to be honest. Some people probably judged him as a bad painter. I think in his time, and he didn't make any money in his time. You know, this is something that sometimes these great master artists these are people that we just take for granted they're great, right? We sort of ask, or we just accept it without question that they're great. So yeah, it's probably questions that people asked at the time. But I think art historians, art critics have kind of given him the benefit of the doubt after a century or so of his art, really being around, that he was doing something, if not completely revolutionary, at least pretty innovative. And he's someone who's been categorized as a post-impressionist. He is very much of the impressionist school, but the post-impressionists kind of put their own individual stamp on it, their own quirkiness or strangeness kind of gets, the artist's personality gets sort of transmitted quite a bit more, I think, with the post-impressionists. But I don't know, it's, are they just mistakes? I don't think so. They look pretty beautiful, pretty textured to me, like they're done on purpose.
Whatever happened to the other guy?
What other guy?
Like mentor.
Paul Gauguin?
Mm-hmm.
Gauguin was maybe in the mainstream not as well remembered today, but he was the more famous artist of the two, more commercially successful. So Gauguin was somebody who had respect in his lifetime. Apparently there was and I missed it, the last week's 60 Minutes, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, but they actually did a piece on Van Gogh where lately some historians actually think that he was murdered because when he apparently committed suicide, he shot himself in the abdomen, and he which was in a field, and he wandered back to his house. And when someone on his deathbed, when somebody asked him what happened, he said, "Don't blame anyone else for this, I did this." But they've kind of looked at it, and it's not conclusive or definitive, but there is some questions that he might have been sort of accidentally shot by some teenagers who were harassing him. Sort of a guy and a couple of girls who were being sort of sexually explicit in front of him just to make him feel weird and awkward, and they were sort of harassing him the way that teenage bullies often do. And put your cell phone away in the back.
How do they know that? Like,
I did not actually see the CBS 60 Minutes program, but I've read a little bit about it. I wish I would have knew it was coming up. I would have DVR'd it, but I assume that they have probably some sort of testimony or some people talking about it. They'll never know conclusively.
Yeah.
And they have all kinds of letters of Van Gogh talking about how he wanted to, kill himself. But he'd been talking about that for years. So that may be just, it's not really conclusive proof either. But fascinating life. Oh no, I hope this isn't going to be a burden each and every time.
Later.
It'll pop back up in 5 minutes. Okay, let's get into imperialism, and then I have another piece of art to show you. And I like these documentaries, and I think you probably like having a break from me talking for 2 hours up here every week, just for about an hour. I will end up, once we get a little later in the course though, one of my things that I really like to do is film. And so when we get into some of the art lectures, I'm going to actually, I'll actually do some film lectures myself for you on that. We'll still kind of touch base with what's going on with European and some maybe even American painting. Keeping in with the art component of this course. But I do think that even if it was strictly history, it'd be useful to have a little bit of art introduced in this. And I usually kind of approach it as using arts to sort of teach history as a way of kind of showing some of the aesthetic tastes were at the time and kind of the cultural values and how they were breaking out. The art is certainly very much a reflection of its era, even if many of the artists were ahead of their time. Okay, so last time we were talking about, we sort of introduced some of the big parameters of new imperialism, and somebody helped me recap what we were talking about. What is new imperialism? What is imperialism again? Let's come up with a broad definition, and then see if we can characterize it, and particularly, what's the new imperialism of the late 19th century? What is imperialism again? Yeah.
The domination of a country.
Domination of a country by
religion, economics,
by
politics.
Another country first, yeah, and then we'll look at how that domination goes into it. So domination of one country over another. And so you have to think that the dominating country is going to have some sort of strength. What makes this new? We've had imperialism before. You look at a big older wave of imperialism, you've got the most obvious case is European nations colonizing the New World, really dividing it up, Spain and Portugal and South America, the Spanish, the English, the Dutch, the French, even the Danish in the Caribbean and then North America. But that's an earlier wave, right? That's a different time. What makes this new imperialism? What's changed about the world?
Technology.
Technology has changed. The Industrial Revolution. So now these countries can dominate others because they are much more industrially advanced, which means they're going to have better technology, they're going to have better weapon technology, greater militaries. Even with fewer people, they will be able to dominate because of the better weaponry. What else? What else? So this gives us the reason how big countries can dominate little countries, or strong countries become strong in order to dominate others. Well, what about the reasons why? What makes them new imperialism?
Don't they do it more from like an economic standpoint?
Okay, they certainly still have that, but it doesn't distinguish them from the older ways, because economics is always kind of one of the first tiers of imperialism. But maybe specifically economics in this period, what would be different about economics? In an older wave of imperialism, they're probably hoping for agricultural settlements, probably hoping for maybe increased trade. Certainly the French and the Dutch, when they were colonizing parts of North America, were hoping to establish a trading network with Native Americans. But in a newer wave of imperialism, what might be the new economic dimension to it?
Manufacturing.
Manufacturing, and so what are they looking for with the colony? They're looking for suppliers of raw materials. Do you want to add to that?
New market.
New markets, yeah. Here is a colony. And this is the opposite of classical liberal economics. This is not free trade. Okay, this is rigging
Forced
the rules of the
trade.
game. Yeah, this is with free trade. You've got the open market. Country X is going to sell whatever they produce to whoever will pay the best price. But in this case, you're going to have a system where an imperial power is going to try to regulate trade, dominate it, manipulate it, so that a colony is a guaranteed market for them. Not one that they really have to compete for, but a guaranteed market, and also a supplier of some sort of natural resource, raw material, that the imperial country probably cannot produce themselves. Either they don't have the climate to grow that kind of agriculture, or they just don't have the natural resources. They don't have the coal or the iron or the oil. And so that's how you get a lot of these dominating countries. But what about besides economics? Economics is always the most tangible, right? Historians have traditionally always pointed to economics as a motivation for imperial interests. It's easy to track how much cargo goes through the Panama Canal, right? And we know you can put that in quantifiable numbers and say that there is, the United States has this much of an economic interest in taking over a place like Panama, at least temporarily, and taking over a French-started construction project that would allow us to move goods right through the isthmus, right? Circumnavigating the whole South American continent if we want to move goods from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. We can look at hardcore numbers. It's really easy, it's very tangible to say there are these economic goals. But what are some of the other reasons? Economics has always been a part of imperialism. What seems to be new behind the imperial motives in the late 19th century?
Well, sometimes they thought that they had a duty to bring these Western countries to civilize them, Christianize them.
Yeah, there's a bit of an ideological morality behind it. Even if we can look at it today as being that's kind of a condescending or patronizing attitude to look at another part of the world and say, we're better, let's make them more like us. But people do have their prejudices. And this is very much reflected in Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. The idea, and he wasn't so much thinking in systematic ideological racial terms, like the social Darwinist will. But Rudyard Kipling said it's the white man's burden because Europe, the United States, dominantly white, these were the most materially advanced, most industrial nations, and they had a duty, a burden, to bring some of those material comforts to other parts of the world, underdeveloped or undeveloped parts of the world. To bring Western medicine, to build hospitals, to build roads. To do this, even though it's very much a thankless task. And of course, that sort of foreign presence can be resented. There are going to be attitudes of racism that will be absorbed by the native population, maybe expressed as an inferiority complex. Certainly you get that in Cuba, one of the countries that I really study in relation to the United States. In India, you're going to get more of a when they see British racism, right? They're going to react against it, not so much absorb it in the sense that they're going to feel inferior, but this is going to really strike up a pro-Indian nationalist movement to fight off the British, and we've already talked about that. We talked about it on Tuesday with B.G. Tilley and Mohandas Gandhi. Any other reason? Sometimes, yeah.
Validation as a superpower. A lot of times, it was like Germany and Italy was the last to kind of get in the race, and it was kind of like, they carried that for a long time till they really overdone it towards 1945.
Mm-hmm. Validation as a superpower, sort of prestige. We all look at maps now, and if sometimes the map is color coded, and you can say where the British Empire is. And it's not just Great Britain anymore, but it's all these little areas of red all over the place. Britain probably actually was getting more out of its empire than Germany or Italy were. Germany and Italy are very good examples because they were probably taking parts of Africa and other locales just for prestige sake, just to sort of flex their muscles. This is a sort of soft, intangible, abstract reason for it. It's hard to measure the value of prestige. It's not like the economic thing where we're measuring dollars and cents. And so you've got all these different reasons. I talked a little bit about this on Tuesday, about how sometimes you even have people in these undeveloped regions actually inviting empire. This is not just a story of bully versus victim anymore, but it gets much more nuanced, and there are bad guys all around in this story. Okay, so we left off talking about China and Japan, about how they had faced European domination, not colonization. They didn't become European colonies, although China was close to being carved up. But they did in some ways have to face European, at least economic domination. That economic domination is supported by military power. Matthew Commodore Perry, flexing his American muscles in Tokyo Bay. And that led to these sort of nationalist movements in China and Japan as well. You would see some revolutions in both countries, the Meiji Restoration in Japan, the sort of birth of the Chinese Republic in the early 20th century that will overthrow the Qing dynasty, that Manchu dynasty, and will stay in power until there's a communist revolution in the late 1940s. Let's take a look. Okay, so where I left off was with the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is often called the sick man of Europe. If you consider parts of the Middle East, certainly the home, Turkey is sometimes considered part of Europe, kind of a part of the Middle East, or right in the middle. Turkey is a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, so it's a member of NATO, which we usually think of as American, Canadian, and European. But the Ottoman Empire had been around for a long time. And you can see that if you look at the map, these boundaries are at its greatest extent really in the early 19th century. It's got all this territory. But it's going to start losing pieces of its empire because of one sort of local fight or another. This is multinational empire. It's mostly run by the Turks, the Ottoman Turks. And so the pieces in the bright yellow are sort of the first to break off. Then in the orange, eventually you're going to get to this point where it's just down to Turkey in 1924. A lot of that has to do with them taking the wrong side in the First World War. The Ottoman Empire will actually join with the Austro-Hungarian Empire, another multi-ethnic empire that will eventually die or divide up because of nationalist or ethnic tensions. And they are also on the side of Germany, these defeated Central Powers in the Second World War. So this is the story of an empire actually then being divided up, of falling apart. But because of their defeat in the First World War, and we're going to cover the First World War in 2 weeks in pretty much good detail. Because of that, there is going to be some European domination of the Middle East. Because the Ottomans were on the losing part of the war, the losers had to suffer all kinds of breaking up their empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire will be busted up into all these different little countries. Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia gets created. Yugoslavia is created after the First World War. In the Ottoman Empire, you're going to have now the creation of a whole new Middle Eastern map. You're going to have, for the first time, new countries like Iraq, and Jordan, and Syria, and Lebanon. These countries are going to be created because of the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. And they become, these territories then become mandates, as they're called. The French and the British in particular will control parts of the Middle East. And it's meant to be temporary control, but it is sort of an imperial domination. of these new states. And Britain, in particular, will get Palestine. So there's a lot going on at this time. Britain is sort of in charge of a Palestinian mandate. There's never been an independent Palestine, by the way. Before it was a British possession, it was possession of the Ottoman Empire. And under British rule here, you have a foreign minister, Arthur Balfour, who makes a famous declaration in 1917, probably promising more to the Zionists than he can actually deliver on. Remember Zion, Theodor Herzl, the idea of a Jewish homeland returning to its historic homeland in Palestine. So Arthur Balfour says this: I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the British government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. The British, only recently in Palestine now, they have a mandate. They're on the victorious side of the First World War. The war's not even over yet, though. The Ottomans are pretty much defeated by 1917, but they won't officially be defeated for another year. But the British are already promising quite a big thing to the Zionist movement, a Jewish homeland. It's not going to happen for a while, for another 30 years. But this is going to ruffle some feathers. And after the Ottoman defeat, you're going to have an empire. The Ottoman Empire in the Middle East is discredited by most of its own members. People are very upset with it, unhappy with it by this point, and especially being on a more or less a defeated side of the war. There are all kinds of independence movements that are trying to break out. And even though the seat of power in the Ottoman Empire is in Turkey, you do have a separate Turkish resistance movement to the Ottomans. And that is led by Mustafa Kemal, who earns sort of the nickname Ataturk. So sometimes you see it written as one full name, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. But he led the Turks against dismemberment of the Turkish-speaking portion of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire may have been even broken into smaller pieces. What we see now as modern Turkey may have even been divided up into different mandates as the Ottoman Empire was weakened, defeated, and controlled by Europeans afterwards. He is going to rebel both against the Ottoman government and against the idea that you will have European domination in the modern state of Turkey. So he keeps the Turkish-speaking portions of the Ottoman Empire intact, modern Turkey. And he becomes the first president then of Turkey. He drove the Allied powers out of Anatolia, capital, and now as the president of Turkey, becomes president in 1923, he's going to establish a more or less secular state. Most of the people will be Muslim, but it's a secular republic, not a theocracy. Just like you've got various religions in this country, but we are a secular state. So he moved the capital away from Constantinople, which used to be, which we used to be called Constantinople. It was changed into Istanbul. He moved the capital to Ankara. And as the head of Turkey then, Mustafa Kemal, in creating this secular state, decided to ban veils for women. He banned harems and polygamy, cultural practices that had been a long part of the Ottoman Empire. And so those were remnants of some old pre-modern existence. You can see how he dresses. Look at his dress. How would you describe that?
Very Western.
Western, yeah. He's modern. He identifies, even though he's a nationalist and he's driving out the Allied powers, he's driving out the British and the French, he's still going to want to adopt a lot of their customs because he sees this being kind of a cultural path to modernization. Okay. This is famously, when it comes to imperialism of Africa, around the turn of the century. This is famously referred to as the scramble for Africa. Because you can see that Africa is almost completely dominated, except for these two little areas in purple. Liberia, which was originally set up by the United States Colonization Society in the early 19th century as a refuge for former slaves in North America, and Ethiopia, over in the eastern part of Africa. That's the only bit of Africa to remain uncolonized at this point. And a lot of African geography is of questionable value because, especially in the Sahara, this is at a time when people didn't know that there was rich oil reserves in places like Libya, which, by the way, what have you all heard the news?
Yeah.
Gaddafi is supposedly dead, although hasn't been officially confirmed yet. But there is. I've already seen it. Has anyone seen the cell phone picture of his body? It's gruesome, but it's already out. It's been released. Someone took a cell phone picture. It looks like him. It looks like a person who's either very much wounded or dead, probably because of wounds. But it's a face kind of lying in a hospital bed. Gruesome stuff. But like I said, when we talk about imperialism because of prestige, this is sometimes a race for that, especially the German presence, which isn't very great actually. But you've got the German Southwest Africa, which is today in Namibia, and German East Africa. Okay. So let's get into a couple specific things. You look at that map; it's pretty impressive just how the entire continent seems to be dominated. One of the reasons why you have European powers getting in touch with Africa, though, especially along the coast, is because African territory can provide important coastal waterways or opportunities for construction projects. You can have ports. It's a case where people want to have a presence. European powers, imperial powers, want to have a presence in a strategic location. This might be a good way of sort of a fueling station for national security purposes, military purposes. It may be a way of cutting off some travel time. And a great example of this is the Suez Canal construction project, which is really constructed by the French, or at least a French engineer, Ferdinand de Lesseps, is in charge of this. And the project goes from 1859 for the next 10 years. But what you do is you build a canal here. See, this is a little Sinai Peninsula between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, Jordan. And this is almost reaching, connecting the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. But there is a bit of land here that you will have to dig up in order to make an artificial waterway. So now what you can do is, if you're trading European goods, you can sail through the Mediterranean and take this little shortcut through the Red Sea, and then you're already in the Indian Ocean without having to sail around the entire continent of Africa. So this is a major modernization project, a huge feat of engineering. And so the French and the British were the investors here. They're the ones who bankrolled the canal project in order to try to increase trade, especially with between Britain and the jewel of its empire, which was what? India. India. This is something that British and French investors are doing, and they're loaning money to the Egyptian government in order to build this out. And the Egyptians have to pay them for their construction projects, have to pay back certain loans, and the Egyptians are unable to do it. Yeah.
How long is the canal, out of curiosity?
Well, we could probably see if this has a scale on it. I'd say that's probably about. I had it in my notes.
Sorry.
I'm not sure. I don't know the exact size of it, but I would say you're probably dealing with about 50 miles at least. This is going to be much easier than the Panama Canal, though, which isn't nearly as long, but it's not cut through flat terrain. Like this is cut through flat terrain. Panama is going to end up having to build locks for different elevations. I'm going to talk about the Panama Canal in much more detail before we're done. So basically, you've got British investors, French investors bankrolling this. The Egyptian government wants a stake in it, but they don't really have the money to pay off these British investors because this is going to be Egyptian territory, and so the Egyptian government should have to pay some. And when the European creditors demanded cuts in the army, in the Egyptian army, so that they could cut their budget in order to pay off the investors, the Egyptian soldiers actually rebelled. And so then the British occupied Egypt to try to strengthen the authority of the local Turkish governor there. This is still got. This is a part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, so you have kind of a Turkish Khedive or governor who's running that part of Egypt. And you also have an infidel presence that the Sudanese Muslims actually resent the fact that there are these Christians or these whites in the Holy Land. This may sound familiar, but this infidel presence would be resented by the Muslims in Sudan. And so they will of course come to a conflict with the British occupation. You've got a very conservative British government that sent in a general, Herbert Kitchener, to try to repress a Sudanese rebellion against the infidel presence. And so with this big battle, the Battle of Omdurman, you've got the kind of interesting numbers. The battle between the Britons and the Sudanese. About 11,000 Sudanese were killed in this battle. Only about 28 British people. And hundreds of Egyptians. And so then the British troops marched south from Egypt and north from Kenya. If I can go back to the map here, you see that Egypt is pink, or this kind of purplish color for British, and they also have a presence in Kenya. And so British troops are marching south into Sudan and north from Kenya into that area. And you've got French troops who are actually going to head west then. Let's see where they're heading from the west. The French have this presence. You see the orange color. The French are in the west. They're actually heading from the west, and you're going to have British running into the French. French are heading in the same area of Sudan. And so the French meet at Sudan, and this almost turned into an Anglo-French war. And the French backed out of this diplomatic crisis, right on the verge of the British and the French having this sort of imperial skirmish in Africa. The British will have a presence in South Africa. They gained Cape Town during the Napoleonic Wars. And you have these Boer cattlemen and farmer, B-O-E-R, the Boers. These are people who had Dutch ancestry. There's a new British presence there. There had been a European presence for a while. People had actually emigrated from the Netherlands back in the 17th century. And you don't have the Dutch actually accepting the British presence. This is a map of South Africa and divided up into its various regions. But you have a great trek then. Yep. Where you have the Boers are actually moving away from their presence in Cape Town, which you can see. Cape Town is the town right there on the southwest corner, right on the coast. The Boer presence was there, and they, over the next few years, are actually going to move into the interior. 1835, 1837. The Boers will move in their great trek away from the British into the interior, and that's fine with the British for a while. But then gold was discovered in this new Boer territory. And the Boers demanded independence from the British. And so there's a fight between the British and the Boers in South Africa. Now, Cecil Rhodes was the governor of Cape Town, that portion of South Africa. And he had made a fortune in diamonds and gold in South Africa. He acquired Rhodesia, which is today's Zimbabwe, for Great Britain. And his close friends actually tried to inspire, to push Cecil Rhodes into a fight against the great Boer leader. He was expecting some British support, but the raid had failed. And so eventually by 1899, you have the Boer War, which is a very lengthy war involving large numbers of troops from many British possessions. It ended up turning the Boer territories into British possessions. The British ended up being victorious in this. And so South Africa will become more of a British colony with the promise of limited self-government. And so these separate colonies later formed part of the Union of South Africa, keeping a kind of a native language, which is a kind of a Creole Dutch, in a sense, called Afrikaans. And eventually South Africa will be the state that creates a system of apartheid, which is a system of segregation that does not end until the 1980s, where it was completely racially segregated, the entire South African country. Cecil Rhodes, I love this cartoon of him. This is actually called the Rhodes Colossus. And he's stretching across the entire continent, which is showing that the British, if you look back at the map again, the British have stretched all the way from Egypt down to South Africa, except for those pesky Germans getting away. But if you look, you've got the pink country after pink country touching with the others. The Germans, German East Africa is in the way. Other than that, the British have stretched their presence all the way from north to south. Okay. And we should talk about U.S. imperialism. The United States certainly has a big history of this. Even in the 19th century, the United States is expanding westward. And Albert Beveridge, remember, he pointed all this out when he talked about the March of the Flag, called Jefferson the first great imperialist of the Republic. Well, most of the U.S. imperialism that's worth talking about has to do with Latin America. And one of the things that we were also discussing as a characteristic of new imperialism has to do with the recognition of spheres of influence. And North Americans tended to view Latin America as our own backyard. This is our hemisphere. And it's a view that evolves. There is kind of this faith most Americans have that we will acquire land westward, that we will have a manifest destiny to spread our empire of liberty, a system of self-government further west. But we hope to exert our influence, if not outright imperial control. We don't really want to be an imperial country at this stage in the early 19th century. But we do want to have major influence. And that could be just in the sense of protecting Latin American countries. When we first have our really major piece of U.S. foreign policy in regards to Latin America, it has to do with a wave of Latin American wars for independence. All this area in the green on the map at one time either belongs to the Spanish or the Portuguese. And starting around 1810 with Mexico, you have a wave of pieces of the Spanish Empire beginning to rebel, to chip away from Spanish control. They very much took advantage of the fact that the Spanish had been hurt in the Napoleonic Wars. In fact, at one point, Napoleon Bonaparte is going to put his brother on the Spanish throne. And now that the Spanish government, the crown, is so weakened, this is the opportunity that many of the Latin American elites have been looking for to rebel, to take advantage of and become independent countries. Well, in the wake of that, you've got all these countries. In the next 10, 20 years, you've got these countries breaking away, forming their own infant, independent Latin American republics. And they're vulnerable. And the Spanish, once they recover from the Napoleonic Wars, are thinking about getting back in. You've got kind of a so-called Holy Alliance of some European countries that are thinking about colonizing it. In fact, Russia has claims all the way along the whole Pacific coast. And so the United States, and a policy that is actually written up by Secretary of State John Quincy Adams and announced by the President James Madison in 1823, he gives his speech to Congress, later sort of remembered as the Monroe Doctrine, which is a speech to Congress, but he knows that European powers are listening. And he basically declares three things. First, the European nations should leave this hemisphere alone. That there should not be any sort of attempt to colonize or recolonize these sister republics of ours. These people who fought their own wars of independence, sort of an extension of the American Revolution, they think. So, Europeans, hands off. Point two, should any European country attempt to dominate Latin America, a Latin American republic, the United States will see that as an attack on ourselves. And so that means we're going to take it seriously. And if someone attacks us, right, we would respond with force. So it's a threat to Europe. And point three, if Europeans stay out of the affairs of this hemisphere, the United States will stay out of European affairs. Yeah, we'll have relations, we'll continue to trade, but if there are European matters of warfare, the United States will be neutral, we won't butt in. And so we're making kind of a promise here. This is not an imperialist statement. If anything, this is trying to shoulder or protect newly independent countries from imperialism. But later, long after James Monroe is gone, some Americans will twist it. And it will end up being a kind of an excuse for American imperialism. We'll say, this is our backyard, this is our sphere of influence. We've already articulated to the Europeans that this belongs to the Western Hemisphere. And we are the kings of the Western Hemisphere. Now the newly independent Mexico, its territory goes far into the American Southwest, and it did include the modern state of Texas. And this is, Texas gets its name from a group of Spanish, or people who have Spanish ancestry, completely white, not the mixed race of the mestizo, but completely of Spanish heritage. They call themselves the Tejanos. There's only about 1,000 or 2,000 of them, but at this time in the 1830s, the Mexican government, in sort of its view on race and productivity, they view the Tejanos and people of pure white heritage as being more productive than those who are purely Native American. And so what they want to do is actually try to attract more white settlers in this sparsely populated area of Texas, as part of Mexico. And so the Texas government will offer a guy named Moses Austin, Stephen Austin's father, a huge land grant to try to promote this idea of white settlement in Texas. And Moses will die, so Stephen will end up inheriting this land, and he will, or this land grant, and he'll divide it up into much smaller chunks to attract all kinds of white settlers. Well, this is a bit more than what the Mexican government had bargained for, because they get a flood of land-hungry whites then from the United States settling in Texas. And when the Mexican government then tries to retract its offer, Stephen Austin is going to lead forces of Tejanos and white settlers, and some mestizos as well in Texas, against the Mexican government. Eventually, leading the way all the way in 1837 to the establishment of the Republic of Texas. And one of the guys who brings about the final victory, Sam Houston, will be the first president of a new Republic of Texas. Texas is recognized, it recognizes its own territory as being quite big. Mexico said it was only this size, right? It only belonged to this yellow area. And so that's all disputed territory. Right away, the new Republic of Texas wants to be annexed by the United States, wants to be absorbed in a part of the U.S. The United States, though, the administrations of Andrew Jackson and Mark Van Buren were afraid of really incorporating this into the U.S. just now, because westward expansion invited the whole slavery issue to once again rear its head. And so it was shelved for a while, but revived in 1845. And so the United States will actually then expand and gain Texas territory through annexation in 1845. It happens right before President Polk, James K. Polk, is inaugurated. And this new Democrat in power wants to basically gain all the land between what is the established United States and the Pacific Ocean. All that western territory. And so he pushes the Mexicans into a war by basically stationing troops, American troops, all the way up against the Rio Grande River. The Rio Grande was not what was considered to be a part. You can look back at this map again. He's going to put General Zachary Taylor and his men in this green area, this disputed territory. So, of course, there's a Mexican presence there as well. And he provokes the Mexicans to draw the first shot. Mexicans can fire upon American troops. James K. Polk can feign surprise and indignation that this happened and say the Mexicans have shed blood upon American soil. And so therefore we get into a war with Mexico, which in hindsight maybe seems easy, but we have to end up occupying a foreign capital. And so this is really no easy endeavor, even though the war lasts just 2 or 3 years. This is a depiction of the Battle of Veracruz. Eventually the United States will occupy the capital of Mexico City, and we will force them under occupation to sign a treaty in 1848 that gives us the entire American Southwest. Mexico will lose somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of its territory. Is this U.S. imperialism? Yeah. Or is this just, we were drawn into a war, and then, as the victor of the war, we will take the spoils of war. Well, that's what the United States is claiming. But this is a naked case of aggression of a big country against a smaller, weaker country. And so in 1848, we're going to get the territory from Mexico that makes up California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico. The border with Texas will be affirmed. And so what is now the continental United States is more or less completely decided by 1848, except for a little chunk of land that we purchased from Mexico called the Gadsden Purchase in the 1850s. And we purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867. But more or less, the continental United States is decided after this major defeat of Mexico. Of course, the big war that I haven't mentioned in between the U.S.-Mexican War and the Spanish-American War is the U.S. Civil War, which is not really a dispute related to imperialism, but it does have to do with the expansion westward and the idea of whether we expand slavery into those western territories. And with the election of Abraham Lincoln, the head of the newly found Republican Party in 1860, who at the time said he wasn't for the abolition of slavery. He said he would allow it to exist where it already did in the South, but he was definitely against the expansion of it into newly acquired Western territories, which may have been, in the long run, kind of a slow, gradual approach of trying to eliminate slavery. That's certainly how the South read it. The South in 1860 thought that this was going to usher in a new era of Republican rule of a northern political party hostile, avowedly hostile to the interests of the South. And that eventually they would just outvote the southern states in Congress and abolish slavery that way. So the South formed a confederacy that seceded from the Union to protect slavery. Undoubtedly to protect slavery. All this talk about states' rights that you sometimes hear Southern apologists say is just shrouding the real issue in a policy or a procedural thing. Well, it's states' rights. Well, it was states' rights to own slaves. And if you look at their statements of secession in the state legislatures, they're talking about it quite openly. There's no debate about this among historians, among professional historians anymore, or among rational people. So in any case, the first major war that the United States will fight after the Civil War is the Spanish-American War. And this is something that Secretary of State John Hay called the Splendid Little War. For one thing, it was the first war that really united Northerners and Southerners in a common national cause. But it has a backdrop of a Cuban independence movement. Cuba and Puerto Rico were the last remnants of the Spanish Empire in the Western Hemisphere. The last colonies that Spain had. And there had been a Cuban independence movement going on and off for about 20 or 30 years before this war breaks out between the U.S. and Spain. And this is the backdrop. And the U.S. media, the so-called yellow press, is reporting this, dramatizing it, sensationalizing it. This is kind of tabloid-style journalism. You've got Joseph Pulitzer in circulation battles with William Randolph Hearst. And they take the side of the Cubans. They dramatize anything that the Spanish or the Spanish loyalists do against the civilian population in Cuba. And so the American public is actually itching to get involved and to help out, again, to support Cuban independence. And when a U.S. ship, the USS Maine, is sunk in the harbor of Havana, we will blame the Spanish for it. And President William McKinley, reluctantly, at this point, will ask the U.S. Congress to declare war. And so the United States goes to war against Spain. These are the theaters of operation. This war has global reach. They're fought near all of Spain's overseas colonies. We've got the Philippines, which suffered one U.S. casualty in the initial surrender. Philippines had been a Spanish possession for nearly 300 years at that point. And William McKinley said it was our job to go in and civilize and Christianize the Filipinos. Well, they were already Christian, they were Catholics because of the Spanish presence, but that's okay. We lost one guy in the naval battle against Spain there, and that really had to do with just heat prostration. And the island of Guam, which is still a U.S. possession, they were so badly informed that hostilities had broken out between Spain and the United States that when we actually showed up and fired at them, they thought we were merely saluting. And when the commander came, took his patrol boat out to the U.S. ship to ask for cannon powder so he could exchange the salute, we just arrested him and took the island of Guam without a fight. Puerto Rico started off as a surveillance mission. We were just bombing San Juan and to head off the Spanish presence there. Cuba is the main theater of war, and that's a lot more difficult. The Spanish had been fighting Cuban insurgents for years, and the United States hadn't had an army, really a big professional army, since the Civil War, 30 years before. And so we got these volunteers. We got, you can see the Rough Riders there, led by Theodore Roosevelt, who had been the U.S. Assistant Secretary of the Navy, who resigned his post so he could actually fight in hand-to-hand combat. He would have had much more power to actually control the outcome of the war as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. But he liked getting his hands dirty. We will eventually take Cuba away from the Spanish. The Spanish have this port on the western part of Cuba, that's Santiago de Cuba, and they will eventually flee. We have to battle all these overland ports before we can actually get there. But eventually, this is fighting that lasts a matter of months. The whole war is more or less in the summer of 1898. Another reason why Secretary Hay called it a splendid little war. Short, sweet. And we will get all those Spanish possessions. We will get Puerto Rico becomes ours. Guam becomes ours. The Philippines will become ours, but we have to put down a Filipino insurrection against us. We were actually planning on fighting with the Filipinos originally. We supported each other. We were talking about Filipino independence. The Germans show up on the scene and say, if the United States don't colonize the Philippines, then they will. This is the same thing. This is the same time when Rudyard Kipling is saying, come on, U.S., you better pick up your white man's burden. And so the United States sort of has a change of heart here and decides to go after the Philippines themselves. And the Filipino insurrection is put down. And we'll be in the Philippines until the 1940s, an official U.S. colony. Now the Cubans will be nominally independent. We fought for Cuban independence. In 1900, now we're going to occupy Cuba, but in 1900, there's a Cuban Constitutional Assembly which met with U.S. supervision. The United States didn't want any of the Cuban rebel leaders leading the cause against the Spanish to be a part of the new Cuban government. They're the ones with the most credibility and legitimacy in Cuba. They're the ones who had fought. But they were also really kind of anti-Yankee, not really willing to be as subservient to the U.S. And so we will actually adopt something to a U.S. Army Appropriations Act. This is a U.S. law named after Senator Orville Platt. We'll add the Platt Amendment to the U.S. Army Appropriations Act, which says that the United States then, we declare for ourselves the right. Cuba is independent, but we declare ourselves the right to intervene in Cuban affairs, should they be economically or politically unstable. It's pretty interesting. Yeah, they're independent. The Platt Amendment is not abrogated until 1934. It's in effect until the 1930s. And the U.S. Marines will go in and occupy, I think, 7 or 8 times. This is one of those cases where you get empire by invitation. You're going to have Cuban elites saying, oh, we're politically unstable. I'm not very popular. You better come in and rescue me. And so Cuban elites inviting empire. And this also will give the United States access to Guantanamo Bay, a permanent military base that we lease to the Cuban government. And we still write checks to the Cuban government for Guantanamo Bay. But Fidel Castro's government, been in power since 1959, hasn't cashed any of those checks based on principle. Because this is Cuban territory, sovereign Cuban territory. The whole idea of the Platt Amendment in Cuba, the idea that we will intervene based on political or economic instability, gets continued in a broader sense now, not just Cuba, but in a broader sense, President Theodore Roosevelt, president from 1901 to 1909. He will add his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so I told you what the Monroe Doctrine was. Hands off Europe. This is our hemisphere. Europeans should not try to intervene in independent Latin American republics, taking them over. Well, Roosevelt is responding to the idea that now there are lots of little Latin American republics, especially in the Caribbean, who owe money to European creditors. And the Europeans, especially in the case in Venezuela, had shown themselves willing to intervene using gunboats, using military force. Intervene in these Latin American countries in order to make them pay off their debts. And this is then the context. This is the idea, oh, European countries are going to come back with military power, intervene forcibly in Latin American countries. We can't have that. We can't have European intervention. That's our job. This is our sphere of influence. And so the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine is that the United States will intervene in Latin American affairs if country X fails to pay its debt, is politically or economically unstable. We'll go in and we'll help reorganize the economy. We'll take control of their customs officials and how they collect taxes. We'll intervene in order to keep the Europeans from doing it. So this is the promise then that we will use force, and it kind of reflects the evolution of a Monroe Doctrine. This idea that we have a sphere of influence that initially we're there to protect and protect their independence, but over time we get much more interested in taking it for ourselves. But rather than having direct control of most of these countries, it's easier and more attractive to the United States to embark on something that we call dollar diplomacy. And that is using the wedge of American investment capital as leverage to control these countries. Unofficially, you have so much U.S. investment capital in these countries that the power of businessmen can sway the governments to make certain decisions without forcing them to using the U.S. Marines. So dollar diplomacy is something that will be promoted by Roosevelt, by Taft, by Woodrow Wilson. Doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats. This becomes a popular policy, encouraging U.S. investment in Latin America, making it so that perhaps U.S. investors are just as powerful as many Latin American countries. And we have to talk about the Panama Canal. This is certainly a major case of U.S. imperialism. We often call turn of the century U.S. history, late 19th, early 20th century, the imperial age. And it's because of things like this. Now, there had always been a dream of building a crossed isthmus canal, cutting across Central America somewhere. If you look at Panama, it's the narrowest point. It's the narrowest point of land. Funny, you think it would kind of go from, the canal would go from east to west, but it actually runs, because the shape of Panama, it actually runs sort of northwest to southeast. And so for centuries, really since the 1500s, the Spanish had already been thinking about building some sort of waterway connecting the Caribbean to the Pacific. And this is a task that would be too big for that kind of technology. But by the 1870s, the French, actually Ferdinand de Lesseps, the same guy who was the main engineer behind building the Suez Canal, by the 1870s, the French are the ones who start this construction project. And the French are trying to build a sea-level canal through narrow territory. I mean, it's not that long. The canal isn't. And in fact, there's a little lake in the middle where it connects up with. So they're not actually having to build a canal straight across a very narrow gap of land. It's not that much territory, but it's mountainous. And it's full of dense jungle. And there are these mosquitoes that carry all kinds of diseases. Typhoid fever, malaria. And the French will eventually, after about 10 or 12 years, decide to just abandon their efforts. They're using all these laborers to do the hard work from the West Indies, who aren't officially slaves, but are working in slave-like conditions and dying off quite quickly. And the French engineers, the leaders, the managers of the project are dying off too, because the disease doesn't really discriminate. And they didn't even have the technology of mosquito nets yet. They were putting people in hospitals who were sick, and those just became, feeding frenzies for the disease. You want someone to die even faster, put them in a hospital. That time. So they abandoned the project. And by the 1890s, the United States is thinking about building a canal. And there's a lot of talk in Congress actually doing it in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is wider. You've got more terrain to dig through, but it's not as bad. It's not as dense as you have in Panama. French investors, they've put money in this. They've already dug some area in Panama. They hire lobbyists, they hire attorneys to try to lobby the U.S. Congress to take over the French investment so they can at least reap some profit, some return on their investment. The United States is not really sure. There's also the issue that Panama is not an independent country. It belongs to Colombia. Panama was a state of Colombia. And so the French investors will eventually persuade the United States to take over their construction site. And they use scare tactics to do so. saying that there are active volcanoes in Nicaragua, miles away from the proposed construction sites there. And so we will eventually decide to take over some of the French investment. But the Republic of Colombia doesn't want to let us do this. They want to bribe us first before they'll even sit down, and the United States has some trouble with the Colombians, the Colombian government. But there's kind of an immature, nascent Panamanian rebel group calling for Panamanian independence. And so we decided we'll go ahead and support that. We'll support the Panamanian rebels to break away from Colombia. And of course, they'll be much more responsive to U.S. interests in building a construction zone there. Point of this is that we help create a new country in order to build a major construction site. And so it's taken over by the U.S. In the first decade of the 20th century. And through lots of hard work, an amazing amount of investment, we will, actually ahead of schedule, it'll open up in August of 1914. The Panama Canal, after all this construction, this is major amount of work. And in fact, we have engineers who figure out that it would be easier to build a canal with a more complicated lock system rather than trying to build a sea level canal across mountainous terrain, which is all the same elevation. We'll build locks where you kind of have a section that your cargo, your ship will go into. It'll stop, they'll lock it off, and they'll flood it. Then water will be pumped into that area. It'll raise the elevation of the boat up to the height of the next lock. And so they kind of go up like steps, boats going up and down the canal in order to get over mountains or very rugged areas. So this opens up in 1914, major public works project, and it's overshadowed by world events because in August 1914, Europe breaks out into the First World War. Okay, let's see. I guess let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. If you want